Aloha guys, Dr. Tom coming at you from somewhere in the Hawaiian Islands. Now you're going to be angry with me. And the reason is I promised you last time that when we start on this one, we'll talk about Dean Radin and his amazing studies using consciousness to attempt to affect the double slit experiment. And we are going to talk about that, but we have to talk about some other things first. What we're going to talk about is the incredible subconscious mind. Here's a diagram or a bit of a drawing, like a iceberg type structure. Here's our conscious mind. Look at how gigantic the subconscious mind is. The thinking is, guys, that we're inundated with extraordinary amounts of sensory data of all sorts all the time. And the bulk of that is registered into the subconscious mind. And we have a mechanism of some sort that sorts through what deserves immediate attention and what's left in the repository of the subconscious mind. So the subconscious is of great importance in consciousness in general. That's why we're going to talk about it. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground with our discussion of consciousness, although we've barely scratched the surface, actually. One important topic we've not touched on is our subconscious mind. It's a major player in a grand mystery. Our sophisticated sensory system floods us with information. In addition to our so-called special senses, vision, hearing, taste, and smell, we also have a plethora of additional sensory data: touch, pressure, temperature, proprioception. We mentioned that the other day. It's knowing where your limbs are in space without having to look. Blood pressure baroreceptors, oxygen sensors, pH monitors that monitor the pH of the blood, various fluids of the body, and who knows what else. These are biosensors charged with the task of maintaining homeostasis. Homeostasis is the name of the process of all the complex various functions that maintain our internal environment as living creatures. Perhaps as important, or more so, is our subconscious mind. I'm sure there's some discrepancies in this, but basically they're saying that of our mind, 5% is conscious and 95% is subconscious. Thoughts, beliefs, emotions, memory, skills, and instincts. The great Carl Jung, psychologist: until you make the unconscious conscious, it will control your life and you will call it fate. Pretty interesting. Think for a moment about the unimaginable amount of data rushing into your consciousness, or brain, depending on your mindset, every millisecond. It's astounding. It's even more mind-boggling when we consider that research shows consciousness to exist down to the cellular level, maybe even down to our DNA, or perhaps even the subatomic particles. Remember panpsychism? We must have a mechanism for sorting through this onslaught. And we do, our subconscious, also known as the unconscious. Information theory and consciousness. Surprisingly, the brain only processes a tiny bit of this data. According to current information theory, the brain receives about 11 million bits. 11 million bits of data every second from the various sensory mechanisms that we mentioned. Yet conscious thought can only handle about 40 bits. 11 million bits coming into us. Our conscious thought can only handle 40. That leaves 10,999,960 bits on their own. See, you didn't think I knew mathematics. Ha ha ha. What is this? I hate it when I'm disturbed by things like that. And that goddamn thing. Oh, sorry, guys. I almost never say bad words, even when I was a paratrooper in the United States Army. Okay, so something extraordinary is going on behind the scenes. Per current thinking, the brain presents us with a user interface of conscious perception that has been carefully pared down by the unconscious, which can process millions of bits of information per second. Our survival depends on these unconscious processes. Surprisingly, the unconscious is about a half a second ahead of the conscious brain. Oh, we're going to have some fun with that down the road very soon, because there's been a number of studies done, guys, where images are presented on a computer, for example, and some of them are ones that have a negative connotation, like a snake looking at you about ready to strike, and others are things that have a good connotation, like nude photos of young women, for example. And uh, how we respond to that varies, but the response starts before the computer randomly chooses the image to even show us. Okay, now I'm not sure how clear I made that, but it's fascinating. Presentience, it's called. Surprisingly, let's see, the unconscious is about half a second ahead of the conscious brain. The bulk of our lives is spent being guided and controlled by the unconscious or the subconscious. Okay, another of my heroes is the great William Tiller. He was in the movie What the Bleep Do We Know? Dr. Tiller wrote a blurb it's on the back of my book. Also, the director of What the Bleep We Know also wrote one for me, and it's on the back of my book. William Tiller, PhD, is Professor Emeritus from the great Stanford University and is a world authority on material science and crystals. Now, he's a legitimate, well-received, like Robert John, was the department head at one time, world-renowned conventional scientist who also has spent a lifetime dedicated to meditation and studying non-physical type phenomena. For decades, he has studied psi, subtle energy, and consciousness. We will discuss the good Dr. Tiller in detail soon. However, right now he mentioned something, or he gave a quote about consciousness that's relevant. The unconscious is gathering all the information and processing it, and in doing so, it generates small kernels of information, which it sends to your conscious mind. Furthermore, your unconscious only sends them along pathways that the conscious mind has given meaning. If the conscious mind does not give meaning to the information, it's basically dumped. If you want to grow, give things meaning. Expand your consciousness bandwidth. Very interesting. Dr. Tiller's a brilliant guy. I've never met him personally, but I've watched a lot of his videos and stuff, and I have a number of his books. They're heavy on mathematics. He uses a great deal of advanced math to explain his principles. Quantum consciousness. Here we go, the famous double slit experiment. Okay, now we're getting up to where we were talking about. The big question remains, however, does consciousness affect matter? Does it really collapse the wave function and cause particles to condense out of the quantum fields? Now that's an important term, collapsing the wave function, because also sometimes it's referred to as collapsing the wave packet. Other times it's referred to as collapsing the state vector. Okay, but I think the wave function is mainly how it's used. Okay, here's the double slit experiment. We project particles towards this barrier with two slits in it. The particles can be electrons, photons. You can send them one at a time, or you could send them in millions at a time. Okay, then it's recorded on this screen. Particles of matter, like electrons or matter, photons or light, are both manifest as a particle or a wave, depending on the circumstances. Waves interfere with each other. For example, if we toss two pebbles in a pond, the waves from the two pebbles would come about and they'd soon meet and they'd start. And if they constructively interfere with each other, it makes the waves larger. And if they destructively or negatively interact with each other, it cancels them out and makes them smaller. Other waves do the same thing. Okay, so if we're not watching what's going on with the slits, it forms a wave pattern like this. But if we record or watch or observe or photograph what's happening to these slits, they suddenly, bingo, change into particles and form the pattern that particles make. And we don't know why. Remember what I said. You can have this and not be watching it, or you can be watching it, I'm sorry, and it'll be forming particles. And let's say we're recording it, and you can go over to the wall and unplug the machine, and unless you go back and watch it, bingo, it'll go back to particles again. You plug the machine back in, it goes back to, it goes to waves, back to particles. Does consciousness affect matter? Does it really collapse the wave function and cause particles to condense out of the quantum fields? Do we create the universe? Hold that thought, because a couple of videos down the road, we're gonna hit that big. One of the most amazing and puzzling scientific experiments ever created is the famed double slit experiment. After decades, it remains a profound mystery. Now, I don't recall exactly, but I believe it was in the early 19th century that it was first proposed by a British scientist, as I recall. Set up a laser. It will emit light particles or photons towards the screen. It doesn't matter if we fire off one photon at a time or trillions at a time. Or we can use electrons if you want to test matter. Matter can be a wave too. Dr. de Broglie, hopefully I'm pronouncing it right. I've known him since I was a little kid, but he's French and I don't know how to speak French. Matter and energy can be a wave or a particle, termed wave-particle duality in quantum mechanics, a big major feature of it. Louis de Broglie, PhD, in his doctoral dissertation in 1924, proposed that matter can be a wave too. 5 years later, he got the Nobel Prize for it in his doctoral dissertation. Oh, some people are so lucky. Another quantum mechanics superstar. So, matter can be waves too. In front of the screen, we place a barrier with two slits. Flip the switch and let the particles accumulate on the screen. No peeking, though. At the slits, it's okay to look at the screen. They will form a wave pattern of interference every time. However, if we watch what's happening, or we record or photograph or observe it in any way to determine which slit is being used, before they arrive at the screen, they will form a particle pattern every time. The guys scientists are still blown away by this, even though it's been known now for, I'd say, close to 200 years. No, not that much, 150. Extraordinary. We don't have an explanation for it, other than, well, I mean, we do. It's the quantum measurement thing. When you measure, it changes waves into particles. It makes them manifest. Extraordinary stuff. I wish I could remember the quote, but there's a scientist who said, hey, this one thing is, it explains everything. Here's a picture of the wave pattern on the screen, and here's what the particle pattern looks like. Yes, the act of observing or recording the action determines whether the photons or electrons respond as a wave or as a particle. The act of observation or measurement collapses the wave function in the quantum fields and makes them manifest as particles. Watch the action live and particle patterns form. Go out of the room and they form wave interference patterns again. Videotape them and they become particles again. Unplug the machine and don't peek and they become waves again. Every time it's blown minds around the world for decades. But can consciousness really collapse the wave function? Now, for many years, guys, ever since it was proposed, actually, the Copenhagen interpretation and that sort of thing, it's been very tempting for scientists who are and philosophers and people interested in paranormal, spiritual topics to say, hey, it's consciousness it's doing. But remember what we said. Well, if we photograph it, we're bouncing particles off of it, and that's what makes it switch back into being particles. We're bouncing photons so we can see it. But there's still people that think, no, it's really human consciousness it's doing. But can consciousness really collapse the wave function? Dean Radin thinks so. He's demonstrated with 17 studies, only 16 of which is doubles. It's very tempting to insist that consciousness is required to collapse the waveform. After all, it must be looked at. However, looking involves the reflection of photons, particles of light, off the slit area back to your eye where they're interpreted by the occipital lobe of the brain, where all visual processing takes place. Consciousness is not required for this because the act of bouncing photons off the slits will achieve it. No occipital lobe or photoreceptors of the eye are required. We could argue that it took an advanced consciousness to design the camera and film it. But that argument won't go too far. However, what if we set up a double-slitted device that is sealed in a room and can only be interacted with by our consciousness? Enter Dean Radin. And that's what he did, and that's what we're going to talk about. But we're not going to talk about it now because we are out of time. It's starting to get interesting, guys. It'll get very, very interesting in coming films. Um, Join us next time. We'll talk about this in detail. This is Dr. Tom signing off.